Welcome back to the shop, everyone. This week's video takes place in 2023, week 33, August 14th to August 20th. And as you saw, the car does flash up, but it does not run yet. So we still got some work to do on that. So we do get the car flashed up in this video, and I'm super excited about that, which is why I'm showing that first and foremost. But yeah, getting into this video, we are going to continue building the fuel lines in the rear. You guys have seen me put fuel lines together a ton before, so not much to say here. It goes as always. Alright, so that is the return fuel line done. So I'm just going to go through and I'm going to make sure all the other fuel lines are kind of tightened up. Yeah, I'm sorry that the video is a little bit dark here. I didn't think to have the light on under there. But what I'm doing right now is I need to put a end on the ground cable for the fuel pump. And if you remember from a while back when I was doing the battery to chassis ground wiring, I have a little spot right there. So I'm just going to ground the fuel pump right there because that technically goes right to the battery, but it's also chassis ground. So it's going to be really, really good for our application. So even though the ground is now connected, I do not want to turn this pump on until there is fluid in it. Typically running a pump dry is about the worst thing that you can do for it. So if you don't have fluid in it, you know, do your best not to turn it on. Since we're in a wiring mood, we are going to jump up front. So the gray wire there is the wire that is for the coils that go to the driver's side head. So I'm just trying to figure out the best routing for that wire. I originally think I'm going to run it with the bundle and then kind of run it down and up and around like I did on the passenger side. But it doesn't really work that well on this side because I've got steering and other stuff and brakes on this side. So I eventually switch my plans and I actually run this under the procharger up with the oil pressure sender wire and then along the intake to the back of the head. It's a very clean route, you know, there's nothing in the way, and it just works a lot better than this original approach I took. And so this is where I realized I got so much crap in the way. Like, I would kind of have to come under the brake booster, around it, all the way up and over. And it was just, you know, it wouldn't really look great. But I know that I've got a hose coming here for the air pressure line for the surge valve for the procharger. And that goes right to the back of the intake. So in my mind, it's like, hey, if I just follow this same path, you know, it's already running to the back. It'll look nice. It'll work well. So let's just do that. Now that I got that head ground all connected, what I need to do is I need to disconnect and dismantle this coil power and ground connector because those wires are still bare. And if I tried to power it up as is, it would just ground power or short power to ground and, you know, blow fuses, potentially cause a fire, you know, a lot of bad things. So I'm going to take it apart. I'm going to put some heat shrink on there. And now I need to terminate the ground for the coils. So on the driver's side, I have the ground going back up to the battery connector coming through the firewall. But here I'm just going to do a chassis ground because that's all I got on this side. So to fire up the car, I want to have the procharger connected. So in order to do that, I'm going to put, or just loosely, or very quickly I should say, put the intercooler back on the front end. Obviously this isn't, you know, fully where it's going to be and proper because I don't have the front bar on it, but this will do for an initial fire up. And I also need the intercooler on so that I can build this next pipe here. So this is a 3-inch steel pipe, and this is for the surge valve. So the surge valve is closed when you're on the throttle and you have boost, and then when you let off the throttle, the surge valve opens and releases pressure from the intake side, and that's so that when you let off the throttle, the procharger doesn't you know, all that boost has to go somewhere and it doesn't backfeed into the procharger, because that would be bad. So yeah, you chop the throttle, surge valve opens and lets the boost out, and you know, if you get back into the throttle, the valve closes. So I just need to connect the surge valve to that pipe. So we're going to start by putting the fender roughly back into place. It doesn't have to be exact. I know that the front end is going to be pushed out a little bit more, but this will give me a very good indication as to where I can put the surge valve and that it's not going to interfere with the front end or anything like that. So now that I know roughly where it's going to go, I need to do a little bit of cleanup because I need access to my fab table. So you guys have seen me weld a ton of stuff, so I don't really need to talk too much, but what the hell, I'm going to. I'm in a talkative mood right now. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clean up all of the areas where I'm going to be welding. So that's the bottom of the pipe, and that is the top of this billet piece. I think it's billet steel, if I recall correctly. Cleaning it up is just the best thing to do. TIG welding is not great on welding rust and welding through stuff. So what I'm going to do is, now that I've cleaned up the metal, I need to grind a little bit of tungsten, my favorite chore. So I've got that pipe centered on the bottom plates. I'm just throwing a couple tacks on it just so it doesn't move. Yeah, well, no, this piece went fairly smoothly. No major issues. I think all the welds will hold. So I'm just taking a measurement on the size of the pipe, even though I know it's 3 inches. And I just want to make sure I find a reasonably sized hole saw so that I can put a big hole in the pipe that I'm going to be welding this to. So I just get kind of the placement started on the car, just so I know where I want to put the hole. And I'm going to go over to the vise, throw the material on the vise, and finish off the hole here. If I tried to do this on the car, it would just be a hell of a bad time. Those teeth are going to catch, and the piece is going to go everywhere. As it was, this didn't go as smoothly as I would like. I'm not sure why it didn't. Maybe it's a dull and old bit, or I don't know. But whatever, we get through it and we can continue on. I got a nice big hole there, and so I'm just going to deburr it and clean it up. So it's a really terrible camera angle, but what I need to do next is I need to put a big kind of groove in the surge valve pipe that's going to weld to that, and that's so that I can put the two together and have a nice weld. So you will get a better camera angle here of what I'm doing when I grind it, I think. But essentially what I'm going to do is put a big kind of like valley in the pipe so that it matches up to the 3-inch pipe that connects from the outlet of the procharger to the inlet on the intercooler. Yeah, so it takes a bit of work just to get it fine-tuned, and I don't even have it perfect, but I get it close enough that I'm comfortable I could weld it out. now that we got that all fitted up, I'm going to go ahead and get a couple of tacks on this, and then I'll start welding it out. And I'm not going to lie, I had a bit of a tougher time than I would have expected welding this out. And part of the reason why is the weld pool was just kind of bubbling on me as if I had no gas. And it was just weird. Like, I welded the other piece just fine, and then this I had some trouble with, some excess heat, and as I say, the weld pool was just not great. I kind of thought maybe the metal was dirty. In the end, I did get it all welded out, so I'm not too worried about it. But yeah, it wasn't the easiest or the cleanest. Yeah, I'm really unhappy with some of the welds here, so I take a carbide burr and I just knock these way down, pretty much right down to the base material, and then I re-weld them because they were just really, 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 really bad. So now that I got that done, what I'm doing is I'm just welding a little bit of a ridge on the end of the pipe. And so that's so that when I put the silicone coupler over top and then I put a hose clamp onto that, the hose clamp has a little bit of a ridge to ride up against, so that because there's going to be pressure in that whole intake and section, so that when there's pressure on there, that the hose or the pipe doesn't just blow right out of the silicone coupler. So that's what I'm doing with this bit of weld here, and I do that in a few different places around it. Alright, and with that, it is time to clean up a little bit, because that carbide burr leaves a hell of a mess, so I like getting all that metal shavings off of the floor as quickly as I can. Alright, since I have oil in the engine, the procharger, and the transmission, what I'm doing right now is I'm just trying to crank it over. So I just kind of go in the car, put my foot on the clutch pedal, and try to crank it, and I get nothing. Since I have nothing when I'm expecting it to crank, I need to do some troubleshooting. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to double check, make sure that the clutch switch is connected. Check and make sure that the ignition is connected to the steering column, and I'm just going to try and crank it a couple of times. I kind of wiggled the clutch switch and nothing worked. So just very quickly checking and making sure that everything in the fender well is tight, and it was. So now we are going to start the troubleshooting process. So I've got my multimeter out, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the multimeter in the car, throw it on continuity, try and get one of the prongs on either side of the clutch switch, and just see if I get continuity when I put the clutch in. So yeah, that ended up working. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to check on the ignition switch itself, make sure that I've got 12 volts from the battery, and then make sure I've got 12 volts when I rock the key forward on the wire that is going to the clutch switch. So I checked there, and so I check for power on the one side, and then I check for power on the other side when I push the clutch switch down, and I get power there. So moving on, since I got power at the ignition and at the clutch switch, I'm moving down to the starter itself. So I just ground to the engine ground. I put my digital multimeter on the starter, make sure I have power, like 12 volts at the starter itself, which I do. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to check power when I have the clutch in and the key rocked all the way forward, and see if I have power there. So in order to do that, I have to put the multimeter on top of the engine. So I just kind of drape the leads down, put the ground on the ground, put the positive on the positive for the solenoid, and then I jump in the car and I check it. And as it turns out, I did not have 12 volts going to the starter solenoid when I turned the key. And what I found was I'm looking at my wiring diagram right now, and I realized that I have the coil power and the starter power reversed. So what was happening is, as I was turning the key, I was actually throwing power to the coil pack and not the starter. So I, take my Deutsch pinning tool. I have a hell of a time getting these pins out. It was a pain in the ass. I fought with this for so long, but I eventually get the coil power out. I get the starter power out, and then I flip them to be in the correct spots. So with that little fuck up fixed, I jumped back in the car, and as you can see, the crankshaft is now spinning. So that is now the engine spinning over off of the starter under its own power, which is just awesome. That's the first step in getting this to fire up. So the next thing that I'm doing here is I'm grabbing some fuses for my Leash Electronics relay board, and I'm going to put some fuses on the coils. And with the fuses in, turn power on, I get nothing. I get absolutely nothing on the relay. So I'm like, what the hell is going on? So I realized that I haven't done something that I need to do. And what I need to do is run a ground to that relay board. So that's what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to take my, I think it's just 18 gauge wire. This wire is only used to trigger the relay, so there's not a huge current draw on it. So I think that's an 18 gauge should be sufficient for just triggering, the relays. So I don't do this very neatly. I don't tie it up with the rest of the bundle. My only goal right now is to get the car fired up. So once that is done, a lot of this other stuff can all be cleaned up. Yeah, so I'm just gonna run that wire on and run it to the relay board and see if we get anything. And here's the moment of truth. We got that ground connected, and yeah, look at that. We got lights on the relay board. Now those lights are very brief, and that's only coming on because we are currently connected to, what is it, J2A2, which I think is the fuel pump wire. So what happens is you turn the power on, the ECU gets signal, it sends the fuel pump prime signal, and then it turns off. So I think that's a really bad thing. So what I'm doing right now is I'm building a new jumper. So what's going to happen is the coils and the fuel injectors are going to jump down to ignition. So as soon as you turn the key, they get power. I don't think that it's a good thing that, those are turning off after the fuel pump is primed. So we're just going to create a little jumper. We're going to swap those wires over. And so in this shot, you can kind of see I've put some black electrical tape over all of the old connectors. I'm not just cutting it out because it's the last part of that jumper series is what's going to the fuel pump. So I'm just going to tape those up for now. I'll clean that all up later. So now that we've got that rewired, we're just going to go and check, and would you look at that? Yep, the coils with key on now have power. Alright, so what I'm trying to do here is I want to check stat or crank timing. So without the fuel injectors powered, I just want to spin the engine over and I want to see what we're at for timing. In the Holley software, I've got it set to, I believe, 10 degrees cranking timing. So what should happen is as this is spinning, I should on the harmonic balancer, which has all the timing marks, as I'm spinning this over, this should be at 10 degrees. So when I have the timing light on there, it should be showing me 10 degrees. And I'm getting nothing. So since I'm getting nothing and the timing light that I'm using has some like noise to it, there's a rattle on the inside, I think it maybe got dropped or maybe it's broken, it's not working. So I'm actually going to go out and I'm going to grab a new timing light because, well, this one, the original one, isn't working. So I am just putting away the old one, getting the new timing light out, getting the new timing light all set up. Yeah, so with the new timing light kind of clipped on, put it all together, and we're going to try cranking this over and see what we got for timing. And what do you know? The new timing light doesn't work either. So obviously it wasn't the old timing light. It probably works just fine. But now I got a different problem. So either the coil's not working, these aren't really the right plugs for this setup. Just maybe the plugs aren't making appropriate contact. Maybe there's something else that I'm not seeing. So I got to start troubleshooting. Am I even getting spark? So what I do is I unplug one of the spark plugs from its hole, and I just, with the wire, I just kind of ground it out to the block. And so then when I'm cranking it over, I should, if the coil is giving spark, I should in theory see spark, and I see nothing. So I got no spark for some reason, and so I need to figure this out. I'm not sure why I have no spark. Yeah, so we're gonna try and figure this out. So first thing I do is I just check grounds and power. Do I have power coming to the coil pack? And the answer is yes, I do. So I've got power there. So now I need to check everything else and make sure that everything else is kind of working. So the next thing that I do, since I'm not getting any spark, I didn't really get any good video of this, and I'm sorry about that. But what I did is I checked all of my coil wiring. So I checked the EST A, B, C, D, and ground, and also the EFG-H wiring for the entire car right from the start at the Holley all the way out to the coil pack, just to make sure all of my coil wiring is right, and it was. So here I am, I'm doing some research and I'm trying to figure out why a Holley Dominator ECU would crank but not fire, like not send any signal to the coils. And one of the things that it said is, do a system log and see what your crank is reading and what your camshaft sensor is reading. And so that's what I did. I'm setting up a system log in the Holley ECU for the first time. I'm kind of figuring things out. I don't fully understand how it works. I have a base understanding, but the full process I don't understand. But in the end, I got the system log that I needed. So right here, I'm just going to set that up. I'm going to start cranking, and it cranks. It's still not firing, obviously, and that's okay. So here I am, downloading the log, and it's a pretty freaking big log. I'm kind of surprised at how big it is, and it's slow to download. So while that's downloading, I'm just doing a ton more reading on possible causes, troubleshooting a no spark and no run issue, and just, trying to figure out why this isn't sparking and why it won't fire. Alright, so now I have the data log. So I looked at the data log, and this just really didn't tell me a damn thing. Actually, I might be lying. I think what it told me is that there was no RPM, which I was quite surprised about. I was expecting to see some RPM. And so I just made sure that I had, I didn't see any RPM. And because this is a Holley dual sync and mine goes counterclockwise instead of clockwise, I just made sure that that was set correctly. And so after changing it to custom from dual sync and following the instructions that it came with, I set up the Holley gauges. I go and crank, and as I'm cranking, confirmed, I have no RPM. So the next thing that I need to do is I need to pull a system log. And so after all the reading, no RPM, the form said pull a system log, see what your crank and your cam sensors are telling you. And so that's what I did here, is I set up a system log instead of a data log. And here we go, crank it over, should have a system log. So go to pull a system log, and I don't have any logs for some reason. I'm not quite sure how this works. And then I realized in order to capture the log, you got to turn the key off and then back on. And then that'll allow you to download the latest log. So yeah, so this is my system log, and this shows me that my cam sensor is triggering more than my crank sensor, if I recall correctly. And that should be reversed. Your crank sensor should be going more than your cam sensor. I don't remember exactly what it is. I'd have to go and re-look it up. But yeah, so that's what the system log told me, and it also told me that my battery voltage was low, so I was like, okay, let's get that on there. But yeah, so looking there, I'm like, okay, so this, I've got whatever it is, either more cams than cranks, or more cranks than cams. So I go and I do a little bit of research, and I look this up, and I'm like, okay, so how is this supposed to be going? And so I find a couple of videos, I find some diagrams, and if I recall correctly, I'm just doing a bunch of research on the cam versus crank trigger, how they work. So yeah, so this video right here is telling me exactly what I need to know. I should have a bunch of crank signals and then a couple of cam signals. Well, I've got the inverse here. So what that tells me is that my cam wire and my crank wire are wrong when I connected it to the distributor. So I go off and I try and do a pile more, look at wiring and diagrams and everything else. And so at this point, I am convinced that my cam and my crank wires are reversed. So I just go into my Deutsch connector and I very quickly make that adjustment. I just swap those two around. And since I'm now convinced that that's all it was, I'm just going to put the spark plug back in the hole, and we'll go from there and we'll see what's going on. Alright, so what we're going to do here is we're going to hook the laptop up to the ECU, and we are going to go and spin the engine over and see if we get any RPM, and this time we do. It was very brief, but it was the top right gauge. It actually showed something this time, so that means we can throw the cap back on the distributor. We are happy. We are good to go. We've got RPM signal. Our crank and our cam wires are correct this time. So with that, we are going to check and see if we have spark. And as I was spinning it over, for whatever reason, I don't think that I was getting any spark. So I gotta go and, try and troubleshoot this some more and try and figure out what the hell is going on. just doing some more research, and then I think either the camera died or that was just the end of this day, and we are going to take this up on mail call. So we got a shipment in with some new sensors, and this is going to be the replacement fuel pressure sensor, something that is pretty needed for well, it's not necessarily needed, but it's a good thing to have on the car. It'll show you if you have any issues while while you're driving down the road. If you're wide open throttle and all of a sudden your fuel pressure takes a nosedive, it's a really bad thing. Means you don't have enough fuel system. So that's what the fuel pressure sensor is going to do for us. So this is a very quick swap out. The new sensor is significantly cheaper than the old one, but it is also larger in physical diameter. So that's something that I will have to keep in mind if I change any other sensors, is that the cheaper ones are cheaper, but they are also physically larger. So the swap out is really easy. Just took the old one out, put some new Teflon tape on the new one, got the fitting into the position I need it, and screwed the new one in. So I'm just going to very quickly double check the wiring on this just to make sure that I have everything in the correct spot, because I don't want to plug this in and blow up another sensor. And with that, I can plug the sensor in, go key on, check the gauges in the digital dash here. And right before I can do that, I need to, this is a custom sensor in the Holley software. They don't have the Low Dollar Motorsports one specifically, but Low Dollar Motorsports provides this sheet which has all of the voltage references for all of the values for their sensor. So I'm just following the sheet and plugging in the values as I go. I think it was about at this point where I kind of messed it up because I was looking at the wrong sensor, because they have 8 different sensors listed on here. So I just grabbed a pink highlighter and I highlighted the sensor that I'm entering values for, and I just go back and double check it, so that way I know that I have all the correct sensors values. Alright, so with that custom sensor set up, we send that to the ECU, and now with key on, we can see that the fuel pressure gauge has 0 on it. So we are good to go. We are happy. We are, things are happening. Things are getting fixed that I've broken, and yeah, we're just going to keep on going. So next up, something that the car needs to run is gas. So for a long time I've had this fuel cell in the car and I haven't done anything with the back of it. So we're going to change that. We are going to clean up some wires, and then we're going to get to putting the top of the fuel cell back together. So before I put the fuel cell back together, I want to make sure that the fuel return line is tight. So we're going to grab some tools and we're just going to make sure that is tight, because I don't want any gas leaking in there. I mean, technically it would just be leaking under the car. That's why I have this box, is to separate the passenger compartment from the fuel cell. But, why would you want to be leaking fuel? That's just bad all around. So with the return line all tightened up, I'm going to grab my vacuum and I'm going to clean out the top of the fuel cell and inside the fuel cell, because I've been working on this car for a while. I've been cutting and grinding in the shop, so I'm sure with it being open, some garbage got in there, and I want to clean it out the best I can before I put any fuel in there. The last thing I want is any of that crap going into my fuel filters. So just do your due diligence, get it as cleaned out as much as you can before you even... Alright, now it's time to put this cell back together. So the first thing I need to do is I need to stuff the foam back in there. Very simple, just squeeze it down, push it through the hole, put it on the bottom, and you're done. And then the next thing I need to do is get all of the hardware out, and I can't quite remember if this gasket goes on the outside of the tank or if it goes on the inside. So luckily I recorded myself taking the tank apart, so off camera I went and I looked at that, and yeah, it goes the top piece, the gasket, and then the cell, which makes a lot of sense. And also it makes it very nice because you'll see here in a second, but that gasket actually holds the screws from the bottom of the cell up, and allows me to get the nuts on the top side. So now I'm just going to go through the process of putting all the nuts on and getting my hand inside that cell. It was pretty tight, but I was able to fit in there. So I'm not sure how folks with bigger hands than me would do it. It would just be impossible, but I lucked out. I was able to get my hand in there. Alright, with the fuel cell all put back together, I can throw some gas in this thing. So it's just regular, I think that's 93 octane or 91 octane, something like that. It's good enough just to get it running. I don't need super high octane just for it to idle and run. So now that I actually have some fuel in there, now I can actually see if the fuel pump runs and check for fuel leaks. So I just quickly threw a fuse on there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go underneath the car, and I'm just going to crack the fuel line at the fuel pump to make sure that there is some fuel there, and there is. You saw it leak out, so I have no problem cycling this pump on now and worrying about it, being run dry. So I didn't get this on camera, but there's a fuel line there. It's kind of dripping fuel. So the first time I cycled the key, the pump primed, did everything I wanted, and then to my right side, all I heard was sploosh. And that's because after I blew out the lines, I never reconnected the lines on this side of the fender. So luckily the fuel pump only primes for 3 seconds, but it tossed a bunch of fuel on the ground that I had to clean up. And so yeah, so that all happened kind of off camera. But what I'm doing here is I'm taking these lines off because these are the lines that enter into the fuel rails. And what I want to do is I want to run some fuel through these lines to catch any dirt left over from, that didn't get caught when I blew air through. So I finally found a suitable container, so I'm just going to give it a little bit of a wipe out, because what I'll do after is I'll just throw the gas that I run through the lines in an old gas tank I got there on the side of the shop, and then I'll pump that all into my truck, I think. So all I'm doing is I got the fuel lines pointed at the container. I'm going to go and I'm going to prime the fuel pump, and it's going to shoot gas into the container. So I'm going to do this a few times until it seems like the lines are clear. I really wish I'd gotten a better shot of this so you could see all of the junk that was still inside the line and ended up in the container, but me being a dumbass, I didn't do that. So you're just going to have to take my word that I continued flushing this a few times until the gasoline coming through was clear and there was no residual crap at the bottom of that container. And then, yeah, it took a little bit of time, but it ended up working. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to flush the line back through the return hose because, I don't want any of that garbage from the return line that I built getting into the fuel system either. And, it would be possible for that to happen, for it to go through this line, back up into the tank, and then it would be in the tank and then get caught in the filters, hopefully. But I just want to get as much junk out of this before we get to there as I can. Alright, so while all this was happening, the pipe that I had welded for the surge valve was cooling down, so that's cooled down now. So I'm just going to quickly throw this onto the outlet of the procharger and to the inlet of the intercooler. And while I'm there, I'm going to... Oh yeah, that was just a bunch of tape on the procharger that I removed so that I don't forget to do it later. And here it is, installed. It hopefully is going to work just fine in that position. I don't really know. Until I get the entire front end back together, I won't know if I fucked it up or not. I hope I didn't. Yeah, so I'm just going to throw the surge valve on. It's 6 bolts, and I think I may have forgotten to put the O-ring back on at this point, so I'm actually going to grab the O-ring, put it back on before I put the whole thing together. No, I think I actually did grab the O-ring, and I put the O-ring back on the pipe before I put the surge valve on, so just putting it back together. So the next thing I need to do is I need to put a fitting onto that surge valve, and that fitting is going to be for an airline fitting, which will run up to the back of the intake. And I'm just trying to figure out what the best fitting is going to be. Grabbing a wrench, grabbing some Teflon tape, and then we'll install that in the surge valve and put the airline into it. So with that fitting in place, as much as I really wanted the surge valve closer to the intercooler, as it turns out, the air line that I have just isn't long enough. So for a test fire up, I flipped this around. I'm not sure if that's where it's gonna live, but for the moment, it'll do. So now I'm gonna grab the other side of the intercooler piping and just kind of get it in place. So with all of that done, the fuel lines cleared out, the intercooler piping all done, it's pretty much time to get this thing fired up and running. So I got the laptop out, getting everything ready, and with this, it's the first time to try and start this. So open the door, crank it, and nothing. After a very quick realization, we're back in the car, and this is the clip you saw at the start of the video. It actually cranked and fired here. It didn't run, but it cranked and it fired. So the reason why it didn't run the first time is I forgot to put fuses in the relays for the fuel injectors. So the fuel injectors weren't getting power, which meant there was no fuel going into the cylinder. So it was cranking, but it wasn't firing. So at this point in time, I am ecstatic. This thing flashed up. It didn't actually run, but it flashed up, and you know, it means I got spark. It means I got fuel. It means I just need to figure out now what pieces are going to be required to get it running. So for the next bit of this video, there's not going to be a whole lot for me to talk about because I'm just reading and trying to troubleshoot. I'm looking at data logs. I'm just trying to figure out why this won't run, and I don't think I actually solve the issue in this video. But yeah, look for what the problem was in a later video, and yeah, just there's going to be a half an hour, an hour's worth of me just trying to troubleshoot this and not making any headway. So feel free to skip to the next section. So the next section starts at around the 1 hour and 43 mark. So feel free to skip ahead to that. At this point in time in the process, I discovered I had a fuel leak under the intake, which is not a good thing. So luckily I caught it. I was able to clean it all up, and then I, just tighten the fittings. Took a bit of work to tighten the fittings, but, we got them tight. Alright, I am done troubleshooting for the moment, and we are actually going to move on to installing a throttle cable bracket. So I got this new throttle cable bracket in from Holly because it's specifically designed to work with the side plenum, the original front mount plenum that I had. I bought the bracket for that. It was only 2 bolts, but this side plenum has a completely different style of bracket. And also I'm going to put gaskets in this time. So while I was troubleshooting the car not running, one of the things is a massive vacuum leak causing excess air in the engine. And I had never installed a gasket when I put the throttle body on just for mounting or for mock-up purposes. So I'm actually going to put gaskets on when I put this new throttle plate on. The new throttle plate is super close to the intake, but it does go on, so I don't have to modify the intake at all, which I'm kind of surprised by, because everything thus far has just been a huge fight, and every time I get parts that are supposed to work, they don't. But in this case, it did work, so we're going to mount the throttle plate in between the throttle body and the plenum. With that, we can get a first look at my brand new throttle cable. So this comes out of Motion Raceworks. It's a super nice piece. It's specifically designed for the LS style throttle body. So it's got a little piece at the end that goes into the throttle body. It's built into the cable, and then the cable is, adjustable as needed. Another nice piece that I like about this is you can shorten the cable to, as short as you need for the firewall. And then shorten it on the inside for the accelerator cable as well. I got the extra long version because I wanted to make sure that I had enough cable to get to the pedal. I didn't think I needed the 4 foot. I was like, oh, the 3 foot will probably do, but I didn't want to dick around, get the shorter one, and then I need the longer one. So I just got the longer one because I can cut it down. Yeah, so there you can see my throttle was opening via the cable, and yeah, I'm ready to start installing that. figured out a few things. I reached out to some folks for some help, and so I'm just doing some troubleshooting here. And what I'm troubleshooting is the MAP sensor. So that's the manifold air pressure sensor. That measures how much pressure there is in the intake, and as it turns out, I fried this MAP sensor. I had it wired incorrectly. The reason being, this is a GM LS3/LS9 style MAP sensor, and the wiring is different than what is labeled on the Dominator software or Dominator wiring diagram. I looked up the specific Holley part, and when I did that, there was no wiring diagram for the sniper MAP sensor that I'm using. And Holley does provide a adapter from the LS9 MAP into the Holley harness, terminated harness. I didn't get that because I'm doing custom wiring and I didn't want that junction. But neither of the places in Holley show the wiring diagram for the MAP sensor, so I wired it incorrectly. After some research, I figured out that, the Holley Sniper MAP sensor is just a general rebranded MAP sensor, and I was able to then find the wiring diagram, realized I'd wired it wrong, and in that process, I fried that MAP sensor. So it is what it is. That MAP sensor is dead, and I do a bunch of troubleshooting just to confirm that. And after I've confirmed it as much as I possibly can, I order a new one. Alright, so one of the things about all these sensors is they don't recommend that you direct mount some of these sensors right to the engine. Just they don't do well with a lot of vibration. Now, mind you, I have engine plates on the head, so the engine shouldn't really be moving all that much. However, I did order this sensor block when I ordered some sensors, so in the future I may end up putting this in. I was considering putting it in for the MAP sensor only, so I just take a quick little peek and see about where I'd maybe be able to mount it on the engine, or on the firewall I should say. And I didn't really find a good place. I got that big lip there, which I'm kind of planning on to cut out anyways and kind of weld it all back together, but I haven't done that yet. So at this point, that sensor distribution block is just an idea that I have for possibly for a future date. Alright, so right now coil number 1 is disconnected, and that's because off camera I was sitting there doing some troubleshooting, and all of a sudden the number 1 coil started smoking on me. So the modifications I did earlier to make it so that the coils were on during ignition and the fuel injectors were on during ignition ended up biting me in the ass, and I blew out one of my expensive smart coils because of it. So when I initially did the wiring on this car, I did a lot of research at that time, and I had decided that was the way to go, is have it all triggered off of the fuel pump wire. But then, when I started actually powering the car and trying to get it to fire, I noticed the coils weren't getting power. So I decided to switch that over to, as soon as key is on with ignition, I'd power the coils. But that was just a really bad idea. Those smart coils are not designed to have power unless they're able to discharge them, so unless the engine is actually running. So I am just, connecting all of the original wires that I had. Thankfully, I didn't cut any of them. So what's going to happen is the Holley ECU is only going to send power when it detects RPM. So when the engine is cranking, then it will send power, it'll turn on the coils, it'll turn on the fuel pump, and it'll turn on the relays. That way those things aren't running 100% of the time. I really shouldn't have second-guessed my wiring, but I did, and it bit me in the ass. It sucks, but that's a part of building cars. I will never forget that lesson, to not always power the coils, so that's just the way it goes. Alright, so since I am waiting for a new map sensor and I'm now waiting for a new coil, I'm going to start trying to get some suspension work done. It's something that has to happen for the car to get on the road and for me to be able to drive it. I've got some of the parts, and so let's go. And already I'm running into my first challenge. So originally, when I set the engine in place, I had the rack on the car, and I had about a 1/4 inch of space between the oil pan and the rack. Unfortunately, now what is happening is the rack is actually hitting the oil pan. So when I was doing all of my initial mock-ups, I didn't have the oil pan gasket installed because it's a one-piece gasket. I didn't want to, put it on while I knew that I was still going to have to rebuild the engine. So I left it off. I just loosely bolted the pan up, and I made sure I had a 1/4 inch of gap between the pan and the steering rack. And then that bit me in the ass. The oil pan gasket is approximately the exact same thickness as my gap was. So I no longer have a gap between the steering column or the steering rack and the engine. And so what that means is that I need to raise the engine up a little bit to gain some clearance. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm getting the engine lift out. I'm getting everything in place so that I can lift the engine up a little bit and get the rack on. So now that I've got a little bit of tension off of the engine and the bolts, I can start undoing the bolts and getting them all pulled out so that I can lift this engine up a little tiny bit. One of the things I noticed as I'm, trying to get these bolts out is that the front end is moving kind of in and out. So that entire tube front end is moving and the shock tower is moving. So what I do is I take the front bar, I put it around the engine hoist, and I bolt it to the tube front end. That way I know when I pull the engine out and I go to raise it that the tubes are not going to be splayed out or tight from each other, and that the front end will all bolt back up after I've got the new mounting holes drilled. So with the engine lifted way up, I'm just going to put the rack on. I'm going to use a rubber mallet to beat on the bushings and get it fully back against the K-member. And then what I'll be able to do with the rack fully installed is I'll be able to lower the engine back down to the height that I want it, which is, approximately a 1/4 inch off of the steering rack. So obviously you'll see here in a second I go a little bit low and the oil pan is now sitting on the steering rack because I was trying to see if I was going to be able to get away with lowering the engine down and having all of the mounting holes line up, and surprise, surprise, I'm not that lucky. So what that means is I'm going to have to lift the engine up to the correct height, and then I will have to drill some new holes through the engine plates and through the mounting brackets. So at this point, I have a couple of new bolt holes drilled on the passenger side. I'm using at least one of the old holes on the driver's side. So right now the engine is tilted towards the driver's side, so the passenger side is higher, and I am going to need to go back and fix that. But for right now, just to get the engine, or just to get the car on the road, some of the bugs worked out, it's not a big deal. I'll be able to correct that later on without affecting anything really. Alright, time for everybody's favorite, shop cleanup. Yeah, so luckily that was a fairly quick cleanup. Didn't have too big of a mess. But what we are going to do is we are going to start working on the steering. So now that I've got the rack on the car, I can start working on the inner tie rods and the bump steer kit and getting, some semblance of alignment from the front end. So you might not really be able to tell, but right now the front of their brake rotors are pointing towards each other and the backs are kind of pointing away from each other, and this is called towed in. So the front of the tires are in towards each other and the backs are out. Now the way you adjust toe is you loosen off the jam nut on the outer tie rod, and then you twist the inner tie rod to elongate, to move the outer tie rod away from the inner tie rod, and that will push the front of the wheel outward. And so that's what I'm doing right now. I've got the jam nuts free, and I'm just going to turn the inner tie rods to kind of get these wheels as straight as I can. So you'll get a very good view of what I'm talking about right here. You're going to start seeing, as I'm adjusting this, that the entire rotor is actually rotating, and the front of it's going more towards the outside of the car and the back is coming in. So that's just spinning the inner tie rod in order to make that adjustment. So I'm doing the same thing on the passenger side. And the reason why I'm doing this is I've upgraded these spindles to a later model year. So these are spindles off of a 2000 Mustang. And obviously this is an 85 Capri or 85 Mustang, same thing. And it changes the geometry. So the later Mustangs have a longer inner tie rod, and I believe it's longer by an inch or an inch and a quarter, something like that. So what that would do is, right now the front tires are still pointed towards each other. So ideally you would have the same distance between the front of the tires and the back of the tires. So if you took a measurement from the front of the rotor and you took a measurement at the back of the rotor, it's the same. That means the wheels are pointed straight. Now, mind you, you could have it so that they are, angled left or angled right and still be the same, but for all intents and purposes, you want the wheels the same distance so that they're pointing straight. So I can't do that with the foxbody inner tie rods because they're just not long enough, so I don't get enough adjustment to make that happen. So what I'm going to do is, right now I am undoing the boot on the inner tie rod, and then I'm going to take a crescent wrench and I'm going to spin the inner tie rod off of the steering rack. And then we're just going to repeat that same thing on the driver's side. So I am doing a bit of an instructional video on the steering stuff that will come out at some point in time. Keep an eye out for that. But what I'm doing is I'm just taking all the pieces apart from the front steering, so that way I can kind of line them up with the new stuff and get some pictures and stuff like that for the instructional video. So here's the new parts from a later foxbody, and this box came with some metal shavings in it, which was really odd, but what can you do? So yeah, so I'm just laying out all the new parts. So that's the new SN95. SN is the Mustang after the foxbody, so foxbodies were 79 to 93. SN95s were 94 to 2003, if I recall correctly. So those inner tie rods are off the SN95 Mustangs. And as you can already see, they are a fair amount longer than the foxbody ones. So that will allow me to get the toe correct. What I'm laying out here are pieces for the bump steer kit. So the SN95 spindles change the steering geometry of the car. I'm not super knowledgeable, so I'm not going to try and explain it. You can go and do your own research. But this bump steer kit aims to help correct that for the foxbody using SN95 spindles. So that's the route I'm going with. So I'm doing my instructional video. I'm just kind of showing how this all this bolts together, and have a bit of trouble getting this piece threaded onto the tie rod end. So just give it a little bit of lube, but something's not right, and it's not threading on like it should. These are brand new parts, so I compared the threads from the foxbody inner tie rod and the SN95 inner tie rod, and they're different. So they changed the threads between the foxbodies and the SN95s, and so this bump steer kit is not going to work. And man, that is just so frustrating, but you know, what can you do other than realize I got the wrong parts? I'm going to probably end up selling those. I've already got a new bump steer kit on order for the SN95, so that way I can use the proper inner tie rods. I can use the bump steer kit that's going to work with the spindles, the SN95 spindles, and we'll try and make the most of it. But that means another project is on hold, so I can't start the car, I can't run the car, and I can no longer work on the steering on the car. So number of projects on hold, 2, I guess. So since that project's on hold, let's just do a little bit of cleanup before we carry on with trying to do something else. Alright, so now that we got the shop a little bit cleaned up, we are going to start on the next part of the steering shaft. So the shaft goes between the steering rack and the steering column, and so we're just going to start trying to get it fitted in there and see how we're going to make it work. So if we take a quick look at the steering shaft when I bring it out, there's actually some broken pieces on here. I know that going into this. I'm just trying to get this fitted in to see if it'll actually work. And not to my surprise, it doesn't fit for shit. So because of the headers, it's banging up against the headers. These have what's called a big rag joint, I think they call them. In any case, it's that big massive knuckle right at the end, and it smashes up against the headers pretty good, so you know it's not going to work for what we need. So of course another project just doesn't work. But fortunately this time I had already done a bunch of reading prior to trying to start this project, and I've already bought a Maximum Motorsports steering shaft. It's got smaller joints on it. The U-joints are welded to the shaft for more strength, so you don't have what's the word I'm looking for here? Allen or set screws to hold it in place that can back out. So the steering shaft is also collapsible, so at the end it's kind of a slip joint, so you can pull it away, so you can get it in and out a little bit easier. So we're going to try and get this fitted in. So the first thing we got to do is we need to get this steering shaft inserted into the steering column, and this took a fair amount of beating, and I didn't realize it at the time, but you can kind of see this as I'm beating it in. The steering shaft is collapsible, so as I'm beating this steering shaft in, it's also pushing the receiving shaft further up into the steering column, so it gets to a point where it's been pushed in so far that the new steering shaft, even when it's fully extended, doesn't even reach the steering rack. So in my mind, I'm like, so the steering shaft just doesn't work. It's completely and totally screwed. You know, I think I show it maybe right here if I get you a good enough angle, if I'm smart. Yeah, so I'm sorry, but I don't really show you a good angle. But just to tell you, the steering shaft that I just put in is about 1.5 inches too short to reach the steering rack. And again, that's because as I was beating the steering shaft in, the steering column itself was collapsing down, and I just didn't realize it at that point. But the next problem that I have is the headers. Especially the number 7 header is directly in line with the steering rack. So what I'm doing is I'm coming under the car, I'm undoing the O2 sensor. And now I'm going to start pulling off this driver side header. And the reason why I'm pulling the driver side header off is I need to figure out if I'm going to modify this header, if I can buy a new one, what can I do with it. So with the header out, I try and get the steering shaft onto the steering rack, but yeah, it just does not fit. So go off camera, do some research, and that's when I realized that this steering shaft actually collapses. And so now that I'm trying to get the steering shaft out of the receiving column, it's kind of extending. I'm trying to get this out from top and bottom. It's in there really good, and it is tough to get this out, let me tell you. So I end up stop trying to pull this out, and I just pull the entire steering column and shaft out and put this up on the bench in the vise and kind of wedge it up on the bench. And from here, I put the pin in because I want to extend out this steering column, so throw a little bit of lubricant on it. And then as you can see, I can, beat the steering shaft, and the shaft, goes in and out on the steering column. So what I'm doing is I'm just beating the crap out of this, and I'm getting an extra couple of inches on it. And the metal that's used on this steering shaft is super soft. Like every time I hit it, it puts another dent or another mark in the metal. So what I'm gonna have to eventually end up doing is going back over it and just kind of smoothing it all out. But for right now, I am just trying to get this where it needs to be and get this off. So now that I've got that extended out where I need to, I'm going to try and put this back in the car, and I'm going to try and push the steering shaft back through the firewall grommet just like I pulled it through. I take that bolt out because that'd probably be a bit of a pain in the ass to get through. And admittedly, this was the dumbest way for me to have gone about this. I should have pulled the steering shaft out of the steering column, because man, I struggled trying to get this thing back in there, and it sucked. I struggled for probably a solid 10 minutes trying to get that steering shaft through the rubber boot. Took a bunch of work, and it just was not needed. I shouldn't have done it. So eventually, after much struggle, I finally get it through, and I start putting the steering column back up into place. I'm sorry for the garbage angle here. I should have adjusted the camera. I'll try and do better and get you guys some better shots and some better angles, because this is crap. But I was able to finally get the steering shaft on the steering rack. So now I'm going to put the headers back on and just see what, if any, things I need to modify. Yeah, I absolutely need to modify some stuff, but before that, what I want to do is I want to go back in the car. I'm going to undo the bolts for the steering column. I'm going to drop it down. I'm going to get it angled down as much as I can, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of push the steering wheel over to the right as much as I can, which means the end of the shaft in the engine bay goes over as much to the driver's side as it can to get away from the headers. And then from there, that'll tell me exactly where and how I need to modify the headers. So it looks like I already got the header off. I'm just going to do a little bit of cleanup because I need access to my bench. And also, since I already have the header off, that means I've already marked where I need to modify the header. Again, I'm sorry I didn't get any of that on film. I don't know why. Could be because I was so frustrated from just nothing going well this week. And so I just want to get something done. But I've got some marks on the headers already. And what I need to do is just do a little bit of another mark, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut number 7 header off and I'm going to extend it. So I make my first marked cut, and then I flip the header over and I'm looking at it, and where I have the cut, it is super duper close to the other headers, and I don't actually think I'm going to be able to weld it. I'm not that great of a TIG welder, so I decide, okay, we're going to abandon that first cut and we are going to make a second cut a little bit higher up on the pipe, which will give me a much better chance of welding it. And so that's what I'm doing right now. Is I'll leave the first one as it is, and I'll make the second cut. At this exact moment in time, I don't actually have a tool to fully cut through that tube. None of my die grinders are small / big enough to get in there and cut that tube clean off. So I'm just going to move to the top, and I'm going to have to buy a new tool. But that's okay. So I can at least cut the top off and get started on that piece. Alright, so we will have to revisit this header later, but that is all the time that we have for today. So as always, if you have stuck around this long, I would like to thank you for viewing, and we'll catch you in the next one.